Hey there, friends. This is going to be a quick case study just because of something that I saw that was really interesting and I felt I had to share related to Johnny Cash. So this is off the cuff. I didn't prepare for this for more than like 10 minutes before starting, but it was something I just wanted to put out there because it has to do with Johnny Cash and the Folsom Prison Blues. That will be our case study to explain a concept that I think is important to explain. And that concept is Saturn and the work of Saturn and Sati, which is a Vedic astrology concept that I have described to folks before, because a lot of people know what a Saturn return is, or that one seems to be a little bit easier for folks to wrap their head around. And that's involved here as well. But Sati, I've described it to folks before that are unfamiliar with the concept as your Saturn return on steroids. And this example, I'm going to show you how Saturn and Sati how they work in Johnny Cash's life and how he's a good case study, specifically with the song Folsom Prison Blues. If you don't know the song, go listen to it. It's a classic. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the story around it and what was happening astrologically with the writing and recording and then getting famous with this song, as well as some parallels to right now, what's going on with Saturn and Rahu, which are the two major players involved in this case study. And so I'll tell you what brought it up is I am currently in my Sati as an Aquarius moon. And so if you're watching this around the time I'm recording this, or really any time between now, which is December 28th, 2024, the day I'm recording this, through 2025, this will hold true through March of 2025 when Saturn moves to Pisces, which actually factors into this story. It's why I'm bringing it up, because Saturn was in Pisces in 1968, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And so between now and then, Saturn's in Aquarius, in sidereal Aquarius. And so if you have moon in Aquarius, moon in Capricorn, or moon in Pisces, you are in your Sati right now. And I bring this up because I have so many people, like most of the people that get a reading with me, Saturn or Rahu and K2, but usually Saturn and Rahu are like some of the major players causing suffering in their life to the point where they're like, I need help. I feel like I'm in a dark time, right? And so they get an astrology reading because they want that clarity. They want that, like, when is the end to my suffering going to be? Why is everything so hard for me right now? Why can nothing be easy? Saturn's a major player in that. And this case study, I hope, will help talk about some of that. So it's been on my mind. The fact that I'm in my Sati is because I'm an Aquarius moon. So I'm in the peak of my Sati right now, personally. And I'll just briefly explain what Sati is, and then I'll get into the case study with Johnny Cash and his Sati, and how the Folsom Prison Blues relates. So Sati is a 7.5-year period where Saturn transits over your natal moon. So it's 7.5 years. It's the Sanskrit word Sati translates to 7.5 in English because it's a 7.5-year period. And it's Saturn stays in a sign for roughly 2.5 years. It can be a little bit shorter. It can be like a little bit closer to 2. I think this time in Aquarius, it's there from January of 2023. January of 2023 through March of 2025. So that's like 2 years and 3 months, right? But it did briefly move into Aquarius in 2022 and then retrograded back to Capricorn. So it averages out to 2.5 years. Sometimes, like, Saturn was in Capricorn from January of 2020 through January of 2023. So that's almost 3 years. So you see, it averages out to about 2.5 years, depending on the retrogrades that Saturn spends in a sign. And that means when Saturn transits your natal moon, the same sign as your natal moon, that's 2.5 years. So where does the 7.5 comes from is the sign before and the sign after, what we would call in Vedic astrology the second sign from your natal moon, which is the sign immediately after, and the 12th sign from your natal moon, which is the sign immediately before. That makes up your Sadi Sati. When Saturn enters the sign immediately previous, so if you're an Aquarius moon like me, that when Saturn moved into Capricorn in January of 2020, that began your Sadi Sati. And for me, for Aquarius moons right now, the Sadi Sati doesn't end until Saturn leaves Pisces, because that's the sign after our natal moon, right? So it's 7.5 years for Saturn to move through those 3 signs. That's your Sadi Sati. It's a period marked by suffering, but it's also typically, if you do whatever work that suffering is asking you to do, if you don't just sit there and whine about it, right? And you actually like say, how can I make my situation better? And what can I do about it? That is when, and when you're disciplined and you do the work of Saturn, a lot of folks will come out of their Sadi Sati, Johnny Cash being one of them, and I'm about to show you, a lot better off, sometimes with fame and fortune. That's something that we see, and Johnny Cash is a good example. So this is just going to be a case study, not into Johnny Cash's entire life, but specifically the work of Saturn through his Sadi Sati, Saturn return, and Saturn conjoining Rahu. And the reason this is on my mind is because Saturn will conjoin Rahu in Pisces in 2025. And I've been talking about this a lot on the Horoscopes podcast. I'm keeping my eye on it. It's a big deal. And I know there's somebody in the 100 Healers Circle, somebody, which is the Horoscopes membership, the 100 Healers Circle, somebody that I'm working with on a closer basis that has Saturn conjoined Rahu in their chart in Pisces. And so Saturn and Rahu only come together every about 12 years it takes before Saturn and Rahu come together. So it doesn't happen often, but Saturn with Rahu in Pisces happens even less often. So it'll kind of move through the signs. And the last time it happened was in 1968. And the thing that I saw today that made me go, oh, I want to do this case study was I was scrolling Facebook and I saw a picture of like a historical pictures or something like that. And it was a picture and it said Johnny Cash performing at the Folsom prison, January 13th, 1968. And so I pulled up the chart for January 13th, 1968. And it was the day, because I knew, because I've been studying this, that Saturn and Rahu conjoined in Pisces in 1968. And I talked about it on the Rahu and Pisces episode that was in like October or something. You can go back and find it. When Rahu moved to Pisces. So Rahu will still be there when Saturn moves to Pisces in 2025. So they'll conjoin for about 2 months in 2025. The last time it happened was 1968. So I already knew this from my research I've been doing. And I saw that Johnny Cash performed at the Folsom prison, January 13th, 1968. So I was like, let me pull up the chart for that day. And that was the day after, on January 12th, 1968, is when Rahu moved to Pisces, where Saturn was. So the day after this conjunction, so I'm like, okay, let me do some more research into this. And meanwhile, in my personal life, like I mentioned, I'm in my Sati Sati right now. So I'm curating a playlist because I have Venus in Dhanishta, and your Venus placement will really tell how you like express yourself and things like that. Anyway, Dhanishta is a nakshatra that's all about music. It's symbolized by a drum. And so that to me, I really express myself through music, and my Sadi Sati playlist that I'm curating is a good example. I'm still adding songs to it that when I hear them, if they resonate with what my experience and knowledge of Sadi Sati is, I add them to the playlist because it's a hard time. You know, it's a hard time for mindset. And so that's what the playlist I'm hoping it helps me with. And I've shared it with folks. It's on Spotify. I've shared it in my Facebook group a bunch of times. Maybe I'll put it in the comments of this video after I'm done recording. I should have had it ready, but I didn't because I was too excited to share this. And so, anyway, this is a playlist. It's just a bunch of songs that capture what it feels like to be in Sadi Sati. And some of the songs on there are more geared towards um, like the mindset work we should be cultivating in Sadi Sati because it is a hard time. And I just yesterday added a cover of Folsom Prison Blues, not the original song, although I do have a Johnny Cash song on there called Satisfied Mind has already been on the Sadi Sati playlist. Um, and you should just go listen to it and you'll see what I mean. It'll help you understand Sadi Sati. If you don't understand it, it will also help you like if you do understand Sadi Sati, you'll get it, right? It's a feeling, it's a vibe. And so that's the whole playlist. And so I just yesterday added a stick figure, which is like a reggae band cover of Folsom Prison Blues. It's called Folsom Prison Dub. It's the most recent song. I just added it to the playlist. It's all the way at the bottom because I was listening to it. I've been thinking, I don't add songs to that playlist lightly. I've been thinking about it for like a couple weeks. And every time I hear it, I'm like, this is the vibe of Sadi Sati. It is. It's the whole idea is like if you listen to the words of the song, and for some reason that cover of it captures it better for me, in my opinion, than the original. Just something about the way, I don't know the name of the lead singer of Stick Figure, but the way he sings it really captures the vibe of the line where he's like, I know it, I had it coming. I know I can't be free. And the people keep on moving. That's what tortures me. That is Sadi Sati. Like you're paying off karma. Anything that you're suffering with in Sadi Sati is like, you had it coming. And some part of you probably knows that you are just dealing with your shit. You know, it's time to pay the piper. That's Sadi Sati, right? And yeah, I know I had it coming. I know I can't be free. It's like this concept of like I feel imprisoned, but I know there's nothing I can do about it, right? That is what Sadi Sati feels like. And that's kind of the whole idea of the playlist. So anyway, so I saw this little post on Facebook that was like a photo of Johnny Cash recording the song or recording the concert that he did at the Folsom prison. But so then I was like, well, let me research more into this because I think there's this like movie about Johnny Cash, not the funny one, the Walk Hard or whatever. It was a spin-off of the actual movie about him. And I think somewhere like maybe from that movie, I got the idea that Johnny Cash made that song up on the spot at when he was playing at Folsom Prison. But it turns out that's not true. I researched more into it. And he did not make it up on the spot at Folsom Prison. He wrote it while he was in, let me just pull up the thing that I was reading again. So he wrote it while he was in the Air Force, stationed in Germany. And he watched a movie, I guess, in 1953 about Folsom Prison that inspired the song. And he wrote the song in 1953. He recorded it and released the song for the first time in 1955. And so I pulled up these charts. I'm getting ready to share my screen if it lets me. Of the charts I pulled up. So here we have, this is Parashar's Light. This is a Vedic Astrology software. And so we have Johnny Cash is a Pisces ascendant with Rahu in his first house, with Rahu and Pisces. So when he played Folsom Prison, the concert in 1968, he just had Saturn conjoining with Rahu on his ascendant. And in the research I did around this, he looked at that as a turning point in his career and in his life with that concert that happened the day after Rahu moved to his ascendant, which is where Saturn was. So Saturn transiting your ascendant in some ways is similar to a Saturn return because it sort of just touches all areas of your life. And I also want to point out he has Saturn in Capricorn in the 11th house. 11th house is all about networking, gains from career, long-term goals. And so he made his money, Johnny Cash, being the man in black. Johnny Cash is the man in black. And so Saturn in Capricorn in the 11th house, that's a very like, Saturn has this like dark energy to it. Saturn rules Capricorn. And as we know, when Saturn moved to Capricorn during 2020, it was sort of like a dark time for the world. Saturn in Capricorn is very like dark energy. So it's like he made his money being the man in black. That's a very Saturn Capricorn in the 11th house. So that's just in his birth chart. You'll see over here, this Saturn in the little essay, Saturn in Capricorn, if you can see my cursor on the screen. And so just a quick note before I move any further. Like I said, this is not a case study into the entirety of Johnny Cash's life. There's plenty of directions we could go with his birth chart. We could talk about his first marriage, his marriage with June Carter Cash. We could talk about lots of things. Right now, I'm talking about Saturn, the work of Saturn in his life, Sati, and Saturn conjoining Rahu, because we have Saturn conjoining Rahu in 2025. It's coming up. It's something I'm tracking. And this is a good case study into that. Okay. And so with that, we want to make sure that his birth chart is right. And I'll just tell you his birth date of February 26, 1932. That's pretty like established. Like you can find that on the internet. We know that. But his birth time will affect the ascendant of the chart, which will affect the houses and how they're playing out, right? So the important point here is that it doesn't necessarily matter. So I checked some other times, and I do think 7:30 is the time I could glean from the internet just doing some research, and I checked it in my own way, and I do think that ascendant seems correct for him. And birth chart rectification is another story for another day. I'm actually planning to do some case studies in the Yoga Horoscopes Facebook group that's linked in the description, I believe. Planning to do some case studies into that. I've done it before where I just have folks like you who don't know their birth time, that want to know their birth time, come and be an example. So just like regular people, not celebrities, just anybody who wants to know their birth time. And you have to, the only thing is you have to come and answer some questions live with me on the Facebook group. You don't have to get on live. It's easier if you do, but you can answer questions in the comments. But there'll be questions related to like events in your life, just questions related to your birth chart. So it might get a little bit personal. So that's the kind of thing you have to agree to. Birth chart rectification is another topic for another day. We'll just suffice it to say that I found this time on the internet. I investigated it. I think it's right. But even if it's not, for the purposes of this case study, Rahu was in Pisces all day that day, February 26, 1932. So we know that Johnny Cash has Rahu in Pisces. We know that Johnny Cash has Saturn in Capricorn. We know that he has moon in Swati, likely in Swati. It was in the nakshatra Swati in Libra most of the day, and moved to Virgo, I think at like almost midnight. I checked. And so it is we're positive of the date of his birth. We are not necessarily positive of the time of his birth. But the important pieces for this case study, I checked, and they stayed the same all day. So the Rahu in Pisces, the Saturn in Capricorn, and the moon in Libra are the pieces that I'm considering for this case study, and we know that they're correct. Okay, and so let me switch charts. So this one here, okay, let me show you. This chart I have pulled up I pulled up for 1953 actually first. So at the beginning of 1953, because we don't know, I was doing research into it, of like when he wrote the song. I was like, what was going on in his life when he wrote the song Folsom Prison Blues? Because we know that it came out in 1953. And or he wrote it in 1953. The song, he recorded it and released it on an album in 1955. And so at the beginning of 1953 is right around the time Saturn moved into Libra, which is where Johnny Cash's natal moon is, in the 8th house, in his 8th house. And so we can leave the 8th house piece out of it because, like I'm saying, we don't necessarily 100% know that this Pisces ascendant is correct, but I really do think it is. But that's all another story for another day. But he began his, or not began, he entered the peak of his Sati in 1953 when he wrote the song Folsom Prison Blues, which, as I mentioned, is largely the theme I get from it. You can let me know if you disagree. The theme of it is very Sati. It's very like feeling trapped in your own mind, right? That's what it's conveying. Like, even if you're not in physical prison, it's this notion of you can't be free from your karmas and you have to pay the piper. You have to, like, even if you knew better, this is that line in the song, like, when I was just a baby, my mama told me, son, always be a good boy. Don't ever play with guns. And then I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die, right? Like that part, talking about like he knew better, did it anyway, right? That's a very, and then the Folsom Prison Blues song is all about suffering from something that you like knew better about. And that's very Sati. It's more mental suffering than anything. I mean, it can be actual circumstantial suffering, like being in prison. That sucks, right? Or whatever. But it's the isolation. It's the mental suffering piece that really characterizes Sati. And that's what I feel like the song Folsom Prison Blues really captures, that mental suffering, that isolation, that the people keep on moving, and that's what tortures me. The fact that you're like watching other people not suffer in the same way that you are and feeling resentful about it, feeling like, why are things so hard for me, right? That's very Sati, right? And he wrote the song at the beginning, towards the end of 1952 is when Saturn moved to Libra. So he entered the peak. He was in the peak of his Sati with Saturn over his natal moon for all of the year 1953. So I didn't find out the exact date of when he wrote the song, but I did find out pretty reliably that it was that year while he was stationed in Germany in the Air Force. And he was in the peak of his Sati all year. And in fact, actually, also, I saw that he got stationed in Germany in 1951, which would have been, because of the transit of Saturn, around the time he begun his Sati. So 2 years before the beginning of his peak, right? So Saturn's in a sign for 2.5 years. And so two years before the beginning of the peak would have been around the time Saturn moved into the sign before, which would have been the beginning of his Sati. Because again, Sati is the time from when Saturn enters the sign before your natal moon. So for Johnny Cash, that would be when Saturn entered Virgo. So he got stationed in Germany around the beginning of his Sati. And Virgo's in his 7th house. So that beginning of his Sati, Saturn would have been aspecting his ascendant as well, right? So aspecting that Rahu. So just keep in mind how all these threads are coming together. Okay, and we'll keep moving along the story. So he wrote the song and that's what I have these charts titled Folsom Prison Blues. He wrote the song when he was in the peak of his Sati, the peak of that time of just like mental suffering, isolation, emotional turmoil, especially for Johnny Cash, because we're assuming this chart is right and that his moon is in the 8th house. But even without that piece, it still stands that it's a time of mental isolation, turmoil, right? And then so we'll just do this like I did before. You can see, sorry, I didn't plug in my microphone, so you're going to be hearing clicking that. Okay, so I guess Saturn retrograded back to Virgo that year. So, and then moved back into Libra later in the year. So either way, he's like dancing with the peak of his Sati all of 1953. And he wrote the song at some point that year. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and jump to a couple years later. 1955 is when he recorded the song to be released on an album. And this you'll see now in 1955, Saturn in January of 1955, and we're just stepping through by the months. Saturn is in the tail end of Libra. So this time between when he wrote the song in 1953 and when he recorded it and released it on an album marks the peak of Johnny Cash's Sati, when Saturn was really dancing all over the sign of Libra, which is where his natal moon is. So that's when he was capturing the emotions when he was writing and releasing the song on an album, Folsom Prison, right? And I don't know, I didn't research it that much. I was just really excited to share this because it's an example that feels relevant right now to myself and to a lot of people that have been coming to readings, because like I mentioned, most people that come to readings are suffering at the hands of Saturn or Rahu or both, usually, like 90% of the time. Like I don't often, unless, except for people who got like gifted a reading or whatever, most of the time, people that just sign up for a reading at their own accord are like going through some tough shit and they feel like they could use extra guidance. So anyway, Saturn's usually involved. And so then let's jump forward to when he played the concert, which is what sparked this whole case study for me in January. Oh, I was stepping around that day, January 13th, 1968. And so we're going to assume it was in the afternoon sometime, whatever. Doesn't really matter. It was sometime that day. The day before that, like I said, is when Saturn moved to Pisces, or when Rahu moved to Pisces with Saturn, where Saturn had already been for a little while. So Johnny Cash had Saturn on his ascendant. He had Rahu, a planet that sometimes, like Rahu on the ascendant can bring fame for sure. And so he was just really in his element when he played this concert at Folsom Prison. And yeah, he had just, he regards this concert in Folsom Prison, where he of course played the song Folsom Prison Blues, as a turning point in his career. I believe it's where he kind of he adopted the identity of the man in black, as far as I know. So yeah, so let me just scan through this article. I was reading about it really quickly. Yeah, so I just think that I bring all this up to say that Saturn was involved in all of this, in the fame in Johnny Cash's life. As I mentioned, he has Saturn in the 11th house in Capricorn, which is really a good example, very indicative of the fact that he earned his money being the man in black. Very Saturn in Capricorn in the 11th house. Just a perfect example of how that energy plays out. He's the man in black. And he perhaps adopted, maybe y'all can correct me if I'm wrong. If you're watching this in the comments, let me know if you think I'm wrong. He adopted that identity at the Folsom Prison concert, I believe, right? He became the man in black the day after Rahu moved by transit to join Saturn on his ascendant. And you know what? That's funny. I didn't even factor in the dashas at all into this analysis. So it's probably too late in the scheme of things to really be He begun his Saturn Dasha in 1954. So right there in that time when he was writing the song, and soon then releasing it. So see, Saturn is at work here in all of this for him. And so I just bring all this up because I want to urge all of you, like I was saying, I'm in my Sati right now. It kind of sucks. But also a lot of good things are transpiring in my personal life, but I'm having to work my ass off for every single one of them. And that's okay. Right. So if you're experiencing trouble with Saturn, if you're experiencing thoughts like, why is everything so hard? When is it going to get easier? Right. Like these kind of things. Saturn is often involved somehow. And so like I was also mentioning, if you're watching this sometime between January of 2023 and March of 2025, when Saturn moves to Pisces, if you're an Aquarius moon, a Capricorn moon, or a Pisces moon, and this is your Vedic placement. So if you don't know your Vedic placements, you're going to go to yogiscopes.com/chart to get your Vedic birth chart. And you can find out if you are a moon, not ascendant or sun, moon in sidereal, Aquarius, Capricorn, or Pisces, you're in your Sati right now. If you're a Capricorn moon, you're past the peak. It's almost over. COVID was the peak of your Sati. If you're a Capricorn moon, if you're an Aquarius moon, you're in the peak until 2025. If you're Pisces moon, you just begun and will be in the peak of your Sati beginning in 2025, when at the beginning of that, we have that Saturn and Rahu conjunction in Pisces. And the last time that happened was 1968. And so I bring all this up to say, don't be scared of Saturn. Saturn really does bring positive results through suffering. And that sucks. It does. But I think Johnny Cash is a good example of that. And so just a couple other things I want to point out here are that moon in the 8th house makes him, that's where that connection to emotions, like I think his music is very, it provokes emotions in people, especially Folsom Prison Blues is a good one. Although in my research about it, I did read that it was like arguably a ripoff of another song, whatever. Maybe it was, but Johnny Cash is the one that got famous for it. And that's related to Saturn, as I hope I've convinced you here. And it really kicked off his career of being the man in black, right? And that was also right at the beginning of his Saturn Dasha. He was in his Sati, began his Saturn Dasha, and he sort of like reached this turning point of fame when Saturn and Rahu conjoined on his ascendant. So I hope that makes sense. I hope you're tracking the astrology of the example, and I hope it also inspires you to not be so afraid of Saturn, to feel the feelings that Saturn is asking you to feel, to look at the suffering that Saturn is asking you to look at, and to do something about it, right? Like for Johnny Cash, that was to sing, and that might be related to his Venus in the 1st house, Venus in Revati. Revati is a nakshatra of travel as well as wealth in the 1st house. And so to have Venus there, that's like an identity of wealth through travel. And he made his money on the road, traveling, singing, right? So these are just some examples, some very surface level examples. Like I said, the only thing I researched for the purpose of this case study thoroughly was the work of Saturn. And so I just bring it all up because we have that Saturn and Rahu conjoining in Pisces in 2025. If you want to hear more about it, go back and listen to that Rahu and Pisces episode I did sometime in October. And that's, I think, all I'll say about it for now, because this is longer than I intended it to be. But if you have questions, ideas, more ideas for case studies, if you want to be a example for birth chart rectification, let me know all that kind of stuff in the comments on this video, and make sure you join us in the Yoga Horoscopes Facebook group, which is also linked in the description. So take care. I hope y'all have a wonderful, happy new year.